Great. Okay. Stella, do you still see people coming in?
Yes, but you might want to get started because it's 3:01.
Okay. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. First, thank you for joining us today for the second webinar in the series titled Storytelling the History of Scaling, Linking, and Equating and Looking to the Future. This series is being hosted by the NCME SIGIMIE Contemporary Issues in Scaling, Linking, and Equating, or abbreviated as SLE. So my name is Jamie Malatesta, and I'm a co-chair of the SLE SIGIMIE, along with Stella Kim, whom you'll hear from in a few minutes. Our invited scholar today is Dr. Neil Durant. His presentation is titled Backing into the Future with an Eye on the Past. His presentation will be broken down into 5 segments, each of which will be followed by a short question and answer session before moving on to the next segment. The first 4 segments have been pre-recorded and will focus on how Dr. Dorans came into the field of measurement, how he began his work on scale, linking, and equating, his major accomplishments, and some of his unfinished business. The last segment will be a live discussion surrounding the present and the future of the SLE landscape. So now I'll turn it over to Stella, who will introduce Dr. Neil Durant.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Stella Kim, an assistant professor at the UNC Charlotte, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the SLE SIGIMIE. It is my great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Dr. Neil Durant. Dr. Neil Durant was a distinguished presidential appointee in the Center for Statistical and Psychometric Theory and Practice in R&D at ETS, where he had worked since 1979 until he retired last year, 2020. He received his PhD in quantitative psychology from the University of Illinois. His work has focused on equating and scaling and on fairness at the item and score levels. Neil was the architect for the recentered SAT scales introduced in the mid-1990s. He has also performed scale linking studies relating the SAT to the ACT and developed procedures and guidelines for assessing the quality of score linkings. In 2007, Neil, Mary Pomerich, and Paul Holland co-edited the book Linking and Aligning Scores and Scales. He also co-authored a book on computer adaptive testing. Neil has published numerous journal articles and technical reports and has written book chapters on differential item functioning, score equating and score linking, context effects, and item response theory. Neil received the ETS Measurement Statistician Award in 2003 for his work on recentering the SAT and the role he played in mentoring staff on the score linking and fairness issue. In 2010, he received the National Council on Measurement in Education Career Contributions Award in recognition of his substantial and creative theoretical and technical developments and his innovative ideas that have significantly affected measurement practices. This year, 2021, he received the ARA Robert L. Lin Distinguished Address Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Neil Durant.
Thank you. So we're going to do this with a bunch of pre-recorded things because my internet connection is not very good. And also I found as I got older that I tended to, when I gave talks, I tended to digress too much. So I thought I'd do this instead. Take it away, Stella.
Okay, so let me play the first video.
I want to begin by thanking Jamie and Stella for asking me to give this presentation. They asked me to speak about topics such as how I ended up researching SLE methods, my biggest accomplishments, unfinished business, field projections over the next 10 years, and the perceived impact of the coronavirus pandemic. I've chosen to do this via a combination of a pre-recorded video that addresses the past, how I got into the field, my biggest accomplishments and unfinished business, and I will follow this up with a live discussion of the present and future. I asked a friend colleague of mine, Ted Blue, to assist me with the pre-recorded video. Ted and I started working together in Gary Marco's group at ETS in 1981. Ted taught me to stay in my own lane when it came to programming and technology. I could come up with an idea, run it past Ted, and leave it to him and his excellent staff to take it from there. It was a recipe that worked well for about 4 decades. I will use the questions provided by Jamie and Stella as a framework from which I will improvise. To answer the first question, how I got into SLE work, I will answer a series of pre-questions. Starting with, how did I get interested in testing? The short answer, as a test taker in high school. Were there any particular episodes as a test taker that contributed to my interest in the impact of testing? Yes, there was a classroom exam and an admissions test. Second question, how did I get interested in equating? Well, as a test taker again, I learned that comparisons based on tests of different difficulty are unfair. Third, how did I get interested in score scales and their properties? Well, as a test taker, I was misled by score scales that I thought I understood. Finally, how did I get interested in score linking procedures in general? Well, as a professional, I was asked to link the ACT and the SAT. Procedures in general. Well, as a professional, I was asked to link the ACT and the SAT. An event occurred in the tumultuous year of 1968 that sent me on a path that led me to where I am today. The world was in a general state of unrest in 1968. In some ways, it was a worse year than the one we just experienced. In 2010, I received NCME's Career Contributions Award in Denver, and I gave a presentation the following year in New Orleans, and then wrote a paper based on that presentation, which appeared in the EMIP. I decided to write a different kind of paper, one that was somewhat autobiographical, and that paper is a major source of the material for this video. My radio alarm shocked me awake on the morning of June 6, 1968. Robert Kennedy had been shot and was in critical condition, assassinated minutes after winning the Democratic primary in California, just 2 months after Martin Luther King had been murdered. I had a history exam that morning of June 6. I was distracted, worried about Kennedy, America, and myself. The exam seemed unimportant. Kennedy died the following day. Later, I learned that I had scored a point below the cut score on that exam, and that exam was used to assign students to an honors course, Problems in American Democracy. As I sat through endless sessions of the regular U.S. history class the following year, bored by the basketball coach, teacher's indifference to his subject, I wondered what my friends were discussing in Problems in American Democracy at a time when American democracy was beset with much unrest. The Vietnam War, the silent majority, campus unrest, riots in the streets, the Chicago Convention, Black Power, women's liberation. While my history teacher made me yearn to be elsewhere, my chemistry professor noted that I had a talent for science. Pursuing his own PhD at the time, he infected me with his enthusiasm. I became a serious science student. In addition, my performance on the SAT enabled me to attend Stevens Institute of Technology, a science and engineering school located on a bluff across from Manhattan. It was when I took a thermodynamics makeup exam as a sophomore, after I had decided not to major in chemistry, that I became interested in something that would be called score equating. Several members of the faculty and administration of Stevens wanted to add a new curriculum to the 2 existing curricula in engineering and science. This innovative new curriculum would layer in an introduction of social science on top of a strong foundation in the physical sciences and math to prepare students to deal with problems at the intersection of technology and society. The proposed curriculum appealed to me. I did my best to promote its adoption by the faculty. I wrote articles in the student paper. I lobbied faculty face-to-face. The curriculum was approved, and I was one of its first graduates. At that time, Stevens had a structured curriculum in which sophomores never had to take more than one exam on a given day. In the second semester of my sophomore year, I had 3 exams scheduled for the same day. It was a small price to pay for my move to the new curriculum. I studied for 2 exams, fell asleep, and decided to skip the thermodynamics exam. Instead, I took a makeup exam. In contrast to the regular exam, the makeup was exceedingly hard. The lowest score in the regular exam was about 80, and I had the highest score in the makeup exam. It was in the 50s. I was a chemistry major. The professor decided to treat the exams as if they were equivalent, even though he knew they were not. I approached him and said it was unfair. He said it was his prerogative to grade them the way he did. That was the first time I wondered about what eventually I would come to learn is called score equating. And it was in the context of unfair treatment that I and 3 of my fellow students received when we took that makeup. As I noted before, my performance on the SAT was the reason I got into Stevens. Students talk about their SAT scores. It turned out that most of my test-taking cohort at Stevens scored much higher on math than on verbal. I was an outlier. My scores appeared to be the same. They were the same numbers. The SAT verbal and SAT math scores were exactly the same numbers, but they were not really the same. The SAT verbal means back then were about 30 points lower than the SAT math means. So relative to the general college-bound cohort at that time, my percentile rank on verbal was somewhat higher than my percentile rank for math, which was not true of most Stevens students. Yes, later when I took the GRE, I compared my GRE verbal and quantitative scores to my SAT verbal and math scores and drew inferences about my academic growth because I thought the scores were comparable. My quantitative score exceeded my verbal score by 40 points, which was itself 50 points higher than the score I had received on the SAT verbal. Both of these tests were on a 200 to 800 point scale. I had assumed that my growth had something to do with my having been at Stevens. Actually, it was meaningless to compare GRE and SAT scores because the scales of the 2 assessments were never linked. Meaningless comparisons such as the one I made are made nearly every day by test takers, admissions officers, policymakers, the press, and the general public. These comparisons might satisfy a craving for comparison, but should not be taken seriously. Such comparisons confuse more than they enlighten. No. My interest in different classes of score linking developed when I was asked in the late 1990s to link the SAT and ACT. That event occurred about halfway through my career at ETS. I will come back to it when I discuss my biggest accomplishments.
Okay, so that wraps up the first of the 4 videos. And so we can either do questions intermittently after each segment, or if there are none, we can wait till the end to ask questions. And you're welcome to pose them live by unmuting, or you can send them through the chat box and we can ask them for you.
Okay, starting the second one.
Okay, I don't see any.
So nobody has question, then can we move on to the next video?
Yeah, fine with me.
Okay.
When I was 31, I assumed responsibility for the psychometric aspects of the SAT. The SAT at that time was and remains a very visible lightning rod for criticism of standardized testing. It took me a while to get used to that. It took me a while to adjust to that role. I had to carve out what my responsibility was from that of all the others, the many others who had a hand in that testing program. This is a skill that is not taught in graduate school. At that time, I worked for Gary Marco, who had assembled an excellent, if sparse, staff. Prodded by Linda Cook and myself, we urged him to embrace the need for surplus capacity, which he did. He attracted a number of very talented people. With this added staff, we were in a position to improve College Board testing programs. When the opportunity arose to redesign the SAT in the early 1990s, we were ready with ideas and staff. The recentering of the SAT scales was probably the greatest accomplishment of my career. As my comments in the New York Times article that was published on April 2nd, 1995 state, it took many, many years. Despite much initial resistance from within ETS and the College Board, I was able to effect a change that altered the perception that millions of students had of themselves and others had of them as well. The original SAT scales derived their shared meaning from a 1941 reference group of slightly over 10,000 test takers. In this group of test takers from highly selective academic institutions, the average score on SAT verbal was set at 500, and the average score on SAT math was set at 500. Recentering, in effect, replaced this 1941 reference group with a 1990 reference group of over 1 million test takers. These new recentered scales for SAT verbal and SAT math had the property that most score users thought they had in the first place. Namely, the average score was 500 on both verbal and math, and 500 in what was a relatively recent cohort of test takers, namely a 1990 reference group of over 1 million students. From 1995 to about 2015, millions of test takers would have a better understanding of their scores than I had when I took the test back in the 1960s. Recentering improved score interpretation by centering the score distributions at the midpoint of the scale. In addition, it fixed the problem that existed at the top end of the verbal scale. The top end of the verbal test would typically scale out to about 750, which meant we had to extrapolate up to 800 to assign a score of 800 to the perfect paper. As a consequence, before recentering, the top scores on the SAT verbal scale were not well equated and hadn't been for a very long time. What we did to solve this problem was called doglegging it. And this dogleg problem, coupled with the fact that the average score on the SAT composite, verbal and math, was much closer to 900 than the 1,000 that everybody thought it was at, those were the things that motivated me to fix the scales. Over several years, I made what seemed like an endless series of presentations to various levels of staff, making the case that recentering was the correct thing to do for the sake of the test taker. Eventually, I made a presentation to both the presidents of both ETS and the College Board, as well as a lot of other senior staff. I decided to take a risk by starting my presentation with a simple question that I asked of both presidents. What is the average SAT score? Gregory Enrig of ETS looked at Donald Stewart of the College Board, then at me, and asked me, is this a trick question? I said, no, it was not a trick question. It's a straight question. They looked at each other again, and they both said 500 was the average score. To which I responded that you both are not alone in thinking that. It is what most people think. It is even what most ETS and College Board employees think, even some who work on the SAT. But actually, the SAT verbal mean at that time was closer to 425, and the SAT math mean was closer to 475, not 500. Recentering the score distribution will make your answer correct. I then went on to make my standard presentation, but it was not necessary. Recentering was going to give them what they thought they had all along. While attending a Psychometric Society meeting in Champaign-Urbana in 1994, which was just before the new scales were going to go into effect, I visited my professor from grad school, Ledyard Tucker. Tuck was 84 at the time. He had been the original director of psychometric work at ETS when it was founded back in 1947. He left for Illinois around 1960. Bob Lynn was one of his first students. I was his last doctoral student. That day, Tuck told me that he had heard that I had done something at ETS, that I had fixed the SAT scales. He then told me for the first time that he had attempted to do the same without success before he left ETS for the University of Illinois. I felt at that moment that I had fulfilled part of my destiny as a professional. I had repaired a widely used and misunderstood score scale, thereby helping millions of test takers to avoid the confusion that beset millions of their predecessors, including me. Now, I had assumed responsibility for SAT equating at 31. By 40, I had turned over SAT equating work to Ida Lawrence, but continued to advise staff on SAT equating until 2015. While I was coordinating operational work for the SAT, I introduced a number of under-the-radar score equating practices. Many of these are captured in a research report that I co-authored with Tim Moses and Dan Eigner in 2010. We addressed topics like the importance of the quality and similarity of the test to be equated, the choice of data collection design, characteristics of the anchor test in relation to the total tests, sample size and examinee characteristics, screening items and tests for outliers, and the benefit of using multiple equating methods, especially with the anchor test design, because these different methods employ different sets of missing data assumptions in order to approximate an ideal equivalent groups design. Bottom line advice: pay more attention to the importance of measurement conditions, data collection, and anchor test design issues, and worry less about searching for the perfect method. The search for the single best model that could be used universally could lead to unwise data analysis practices.
Any questions?
I mean, I have a question. So you talked about in the beginning of this segment, the recentering and some indicators that the recentering was needed. Can you talk a little bit more about that, like how testing programs might, become aware that they might need to recenter, or look at their scales over time?
Sure. I mean, what you want to do is you want to look at, actually I talk about that in the last segment, but what you want to look at is whether or not the score distribution is drifting away from where it should be, where you think it should be. And if you start to end up with a situation like the SAT had for a very long time, where you were forced to do funny things to the top end of the scale in order to have the test scale out to a perfect score, then you got an issue that you have to deal with. So you just type of look at your score distributions and look at other characteristics of your test and make a judgment call as to whether or not you should do it. Now, you shouldn't do it willy-nilly just because you feel like doing it. It's something that you should do very cautiously, because when you change a scale, it changes the meanings that people are used to working with, especially the local meanings. In addition to sort of a universal meaning for the scale, there's the meaning that each user has of the scale, and then they have to make adjustments. And back in 1994-5, when we did this, the College Board did an excellent job of informing people of what the consequences would be when we changed the scale. It didn't brunt the criticism that existed, especially from people who were interested in tracking trends over time. But it did help smooth things enough that NCME gave the College Board an award for the effort they made to inform users of the change. So it's not something you do just on a whim. It's something that you should do when you think things are not working properly.
Okay, thank you. Have any other questions? Oh, here's one from Andrew Ho. As test scales continue to change and proliferate, what do you think of the increasing reliance of test score users on percentile ranks? What implications might this have on future scaling and equating?
That's a good question, Andrew. The GRE for a very long time was way out of whack in terms of its scale. And people were forced to use percentile ranks, especially on the quantitative scale, which at one time I think had a median of about 700 or something like that in non-native speakers, or it was very high. I worked and on the old GRE scale. And they were sort of forced to do that. This was actually pointed out to me by a person I went to grad school with, Fritz Draskow, when he was at Yale. And he said, you know, these scales, that the GRE scales are not very helpful. We have to use percentiles to make our judgments. So if you have to resort to percentiles, then I think you probably are in a situation where your scale is not doing what you want it to do, because percentiles themselves are dependent upon the reference group that you have them for. So on a score report, you'll get your scale score, which supposedly is consistent across administrations and years. And you get a percentile rank, and that percentile rank is going to be based on a fairly recent cohort of test takers. If that cohort is shifting over time and you're making comparisons across years, you're really not comparing comparable percentiles. So the reason you have scaled scores is to avoid the pitfalls of comparing percentiles that are not really comparable. ACT and SAT people would sometimes compare those percentiles, and those percentiles are based on very different reference groups, and they were really definitely not meaningful. And that's one reason why you ended up doing concordances, but I'll get into that in the next session, concordances. Next part of this session.
So if there is no other questions, we will move on to the next video.
After the recentering of the SAT went into effect, I left the pure world of score equating and entered the world of concordances. The old ACT SAT concordances needed to be replaced because of recentering. ETS was asked by the College Board to develop a new concordance. As an NCME professional and ETS employee, I thought it would be best if the College Board and ACT collaborated on a joint concordance. I worked on behalf of the College Board while Mary Pomerick represented ACT. Mary and I collaborated remotely on that project and did not actually meet until a few years after we finished it in 1999 at NCME, where we had a session on concordances that led to a special issue of applied psychological measurement on that particular topic in 2004. Mary and I later collaborated on producing an edited volume called Linking and Aligning Scores and Scales, which was based on an ETS conference that was held in honor of Ledyard R. Tucker in 2005. In the late 1990s, I started thinking about different types of linkages because everyone seemed to want to do what I called non-equating score linkages and called them equating. So I wrote a College Board report, 9901. In that report, I suggested using the notion of reduction in uncertainty about score location given knowledge of other information, such as another test score, in conjunction with examining the invariance of linkings across subgroups. I concluded that math-to-math concordances between ACT and SAT made the most sense, while linkages between SAT verbal and either ACT writing or ACT English did not. The advice I gave was to look at test content, not just test labels. Compute indices of uncertainty reduction and subpopulation differences. After the College Board revised its SAT test in 2005, there was a need for a new concordance. The College Board and ACT put together a joint agreement in which they would supply scores, admin dates, gender and ethnic racial data from their 2006 cohorts to a third independent party for matching. This led to a production of a cohort that was the intersection of the SAT cohort and the ACT cohort. A series of concordance analyses were done on this joint cohort. This study represented a major improvement over the study that was done by Mary Pomerick and myself in the 1990s because it involved a superior data collection design and we had better tools for which to evaluate it. The work went well, smoothly. ETS and ACT did parallel analyses, and the results were presented at an NCME symposium in 2010. Every paper in that symposium had an ACT author and an ETS co-author. And the discussants were very knowledgeable, Michael Colin and Mary Pomerick. Unfortunately, the results were never published. And I think as a result, that lack of publication contributed to a mania for concordances. I produced an ETS research report, which was published about the same time that COVID led to the closing of ETS's offices back in March of last year. That particular report was, in my opinion, a response to the continuing proliferation of scale linking studies that have occurred since the publication of the Uncommon Measures volume that Paul Holland was involved with in 1999. I call this unfinished business because the recent issue of JEBS on NAEPT linked aggregate scores indicates that the issues that were raised by Holland and his colleagues in 1999 continue to exist and need to be addressed. Paul Holland returned to ETS at the turn of the century, and we renewed an old interest that went back to the 1980s on trying to come up with quantitative measures that would help us and others determine whether scores were equatable or not. We produced a JM article that was published in 2000 called Population and Variance and the Equatability of Tests, Basic Theory and the Linear Case. In that article, we listed 5 equating requirements. 1, the tests have to measure the same construct. 2, equal reliability. This is a new one that we added to the 4 equating requirements that Fred Lord had actually published in his 1980 IRT book. Third requirement is that the linking function should be symmetric, therefore prediction is not equating. Fourth, you should try to achieve equity, which we recognize is not easy to achieve. And finally, linking functions should be subpopulation and variant across important subgroups. Paul and I chose to focus on equal reliability and subpopulation and variance because they are relatively easy to assess empirically. Unfortunately, we left out the importance of measurement conditions, and that was an oversight. Paul had just completed his book with Alina von Davier and Dottie Thayer on kernel equating, and I was giving more and more thought to distinguishing between different classes of score linking. And about that time, Paul was asked by Bob Brennan to write the chapter on linking and equating in Ed Measurement 4. That chapter included what was then our current thinking about linking, noting in particular distinctions among prediction, scale alignment, and equating. The goal of prediction is to minimize errors of prediction. As a consequence, you have predictions that are regressed to the mean. Scale aligning refers to a general class of procedures that attempt to produce comparable score distributions in some population. And we called that producing comparable scales. And that's why we have the term scale aligning. Equating is a very special case of scale aligning that produces interchangeable scores, scores that can be swapped out one for the other. In that chapter, Paul and I took the position that the terms used for various methods of score linking should have restricted meanings so that they could be used with precision. Thus, we redefined one term that had been used several ways in the past and created a few new terms for useful general ideas that had no previous identifiers. We both felt that language, whether it's mathematical or verbal, is very important to how we communicate. In that chapter, we divided scale aligning into two basic cases, each of which includes additional subcategories. The two basic cases arise when the tests being linked measure different constructs or measure similar constructs but with different test specifications. We also distinguish between settings in which the tests to be linked were either of similar or dissimilar reliability, whether they were administered to populations of similar or dissimilar ability. And in the case where the populations were of dissimilar ability, we then distinguished between methods that attempted to create a synthetic or hypothetical population from the existing data, from those methods that broke the non-equivalent groups equating design up into two single group designs and did with in-group linkings. And we referred to that as chained, basically borrowing a term that Skip Livingston and I had used back in the 1980s to describe chained equating as opposed to equating based on hypothetical reference populations.
Any questions? I noticed that Andrew said that people should pay attention to the fact that at NCME there'll be a discussion and debate about the NAEP scale linking stuff that he's involved with. So show up for that one, I think on June 11th, I believe. Is that right? I think it's June 11th. So I won't answer questions on that. There's a whole session on that. Any other questions? If not, I guess we could move on. Or
Yeah.
That's it? Okay.
Population and variance measures can be used to examine whether test forms that are built to a particular set of specifications are as parallel as advertised. Jinghua Liu and her former colleagues at ETS worked with me on several studies dealing with subpopulation and variance on SAT forms. Several reports were produced, most notably ETS Research Report 09-08. In that report, we suggested that we use a thing called score equity assessment, or SEA, as a quality control tool to evaluate how well a test assembly process works across several administrations. We use the SEA tool to evaluate several administrations of SAT math in that report. Jinghua took the lead on several follow-up studies, most notably a 2013 EMIP article. In that article, we described how score equity assessment could be used as a tool to assess a critical aspect of construct continuity, namely the equivalence of scores, and how this tool could be used whenever there were planned changes introduced to a testing program. So sometimes the changes a testing program makes to the content specifications are not enough to really change the nature of the score. So we were trying to provide a tool that could be used to assess whether or not you could continue to report scores on the same scale or not. In that report, we also evaluated or demonstrated how score equity assessment, or SEA, could be used as a quality control check to evaluate whether tests developed to a static existing set of specifications remain within acceptable tolerance levels with respect to score equatability. In my opinion, more work of this nature needs to be done with operational testing programs for a very simple reason. Score equatability is a very important aspect of fairness. It's an aspect that focuses on the scores, which after all is what people use and often talk about. As a student of Ledyard Tucker, I learned much about techniques for multidimensional analysis, including multidimensional scaling, which is what I did my master's thesis on, and of course factor analysis, because Tucker was an expert in factor analysis. When Ida Lawrence joined ETS in the mid-80s, she and I conducted dimensionality analysis of the SAT using exploratory item-level procedures that were kind of new at that time, and confirmatory factor analysis of what we chose to call parallel parcels, or mini-tests, that were constructed to look like the total test. Our effort was published in a 107-page ETS research report in 1987. The internal construct validity of the SAT. It was never published elsewhere. It was a very cohesive, long report that was difficult to pull pieces out of. Among other things, among the empirical findings we had in there, we discovered that the answer we obtained about dimensionality depended on the level of analysis we employed. 12 years later, we followed that report up with a shorter one, only 45 pages, that examined that particular issue in greater detail. We advocate in that report that the choice of dimensionality technique should be based on the purpose of the dimensionality analysis. And we illustrated how different approaches can yield different answers. Fast forward about 15 years after that. Then I worked with Peng Lin, Wei Wang, and Lily Yao on a research report, 1441. And John Weeks also had a hand in that work. In that report, we examined linking relationships among latent test scores and how these latent linking relationships relate to observed score linkings. This kind of research has implications for test design, data collection practices, as well as score equating. More work along these lines is necessary, as the observed scores are all we get to see, but they are not necessarily what we are really interested in. This is a point that I noted in my 2012 EMIP paper, where I distinguished between the construct which we wish to measure, the construct of interest that we wish to assess, and the observable attribute that we actually do assess. I want to make one final point about unfinished business, and that has to do with scale maintenance. A score scale should be viewed as infrastructure that is likely to require repair. Okay. For broad range tests such as the SAT or ACT, corrective action should be taken whenever average score distributions of the current population move sufficiently far away from the midpoint, or when distributions move far enough away from one of the endpoints to jeopardize the integrity of the scale at those endpoints, or when the reference group loses its relevance. So, with respect to most existing broad range tests, there's probably need for corrective action because these deficiencies probably exist on those tests. So there's work there to be done. For narrow range tests, those are ones that focus on proficiency at a particular cut point. It's the cut score that's most important. And what you want to make sure is that your cut scores are not drifting towards the end of your score scale, so that you're jeopardizing the ability for you to make good distinctions. And this can occur simply because of the accumulation of equating error over time that will tend to push the scores towards the end of the scale. So scale maintenance requires a different corrective action for broad range tests and for narrow range tests, but it's something that should be done routinely.
That's it for the pre-recorded part. And are there any questions on that or any questions on anything in general? We want to save enough time so that we could have a discussion and conversation about things.
So we have a question from somebody, from Ji Zheng. I don't know if they want to ask themselves or I can. It's kind of lengthy, but so the population and variance assumption always puzzled me, as we have seen from data exploration that even random selection may end up with different distributions, and the degree in difference depends on the draw. So to expect gender group comparability or invariance is reasonable, but to expect ELL group versus non-ELL group on test results on ELA may be a little bit challenging to start with. Then does subpopulation and variance assumption is expected to hold in that case? And how are we arguing for population and variance when we know it is unlikely to hold? And how do we expect this to impact our equating and linking procedures?
That's a very good question. And a point that you need to realize is subpopulation and variance is one of the only 5 requirements you need to have for score equating. Another one that you really need to have is you're measuring the same construct. So if you are measuring a test in English, that's given in English with a measurement condition, the language of the assessment is English, and people are not proficient in English enough to answer the questions, that means there'll be more than one dimension involved for that group. So you would not expect equating to hold up in that case, and lack of subpopulation and variance would be one indication of that. There may also be other types of differences as well, but subpopulation and variance is a check to see whether or not you've achieved the ideal equating conditions that you're trying to achieve. And when you're comparing populations that are very different, and in one population, the test is appropriate to target population. In another population, there's another skill involved, especially on a math test, for example, you're going to see differences. We've done research that demonstrate that that does happen.
Neil, this is Mike Cullen. I had a question, follow up on your great answer on population and variance, and really what I want, see if you could address what was recently I've been working on history of equating, and one of the major themes in that history had to do with let me get myself, had to do with what Flanagan and Angoff's views on population and variance were, and I'm wondering how do you see population and variance relative to how they were viewing it and talking about it?
How are they talking about it?
Okay, well,
Flanagan recently than I did, so I'd have to.
Yeah, no, Flanagan basically said when you're looking at equating, you need to state the population, but that if you're doing good equating, it shouldn't differ very much from one population to another. Angoff, I think, was saying more that basically that that population variance is always a major issue with equating. If you don't have population and variance, you don't have equating. So I think there was a little bit of a difference. They from a practical standpoint, they're really pretty much in the same place. You seem to be, I guess, kind of going along the lines more of Angoff, but I'm not sure. And I was just wondering, relative to that, what your views are, because I think yours are definitely tighter and more. I think more. You basically have given a much clearer description of what population variance is, when it should hold, when it shouldn't. But I was just wondering if you had any comments relating your views to Angoff and Flanagan, because I think that from a historical perspective, that's really where the population variance discussions kind of started, and they really didn't agree with one another, which was interesting.
Okay, that's a good question, Mike. I think in addition to one thing, and when Paul and I did the linking framework and talked about requirements for equating, actually when we talked about the requirements for equating in the 2000 article, we probably would have been better off using the word subpopulation invariance rather than population invariance. This was a point that Dan Eigner made to me back then. He said, would it be more precise and precision in language is important if you talked about subpopulations from a population. So if you have a target population that a test is designed for, and you claim that everybody in that target population is the test is appropriate for, then if you take subpopulations from that group and you look at the linkings within the subpopulations. So if you're linking test X and test Y in the male group, or linking test X and Y in the female group, or you're linking test X and Y in juniors, and you're linking test Y in seniors, or something like that, and you're claiming they're all from the same population, then you should, and the test is measuring the same thing across those subpopulations, then you should expect subpopulation invariance. But when you're talking about a situation where you're like, for example, if you're in a vertical linking situation, you have very different populations from different grade levels, then you wouldn't consider them to be subpopulations from the same population. Those are actually different populations, and you would have different target specifications for tests in those groups. So I think that's an important distinction that Dan pointed out to me a long time ago. And I think had we used the term subpopulation invariance, it might have made it a little clearer. Does that make it clearer to you?
Sure.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good distinction, I think.
Okay, we have another question from the audience from Ardashir. They say, I have always wondered about scale stretching in computer adaptive testing. Do we need to redefine how we go about scale maintenance in CAT?
That's a very good question. I actually have said for some time that I'm not sure that with a CAT, you end up with scores that are on the same scale in the first place. Because if you take the CAT, the ideal CAT would be tailoring a test to everybody on an entire continuum of in a certain population. And that would mean you could end up with people who take a very easy test and people who take a very hard test. And anybody who's tried to do standard equating with a regular test, and you have very large differences in test difficulty, you know that score equating does not necessarily solve that problem. Score equating was designed for making minor adjustments due to differences in test difficulty, not major adjustments. And so I actually think CATs, if they're working properly, if you have an ideal CAT and you're actually tailoring the test, you have a deep enough item pool, which in reality you probably don't, when you tailor it to the individual ability level, and you're talking about a broad range of ability levels, you're probably going to end up in a situation where the scores that you get out of that test are very different than each other. And in order to make them the same, you have to rely on the assumptions underlying the IRT model that's driving the CAT to actually be true. And those assumptions are usually based on the fact that the item parameters themselves are item parameters and not necessarily estimates of the item parameters, because the estimates of the item parameters are estimates, they're not the same thing. So CAT is a much more complicated situation in which to maintain scales. I don't know if it's a rather long answer to your question, but that's my answer. At least that's how I think about it now. That may change over
time. Thank you.
Neil, this is Bob Brennan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Bob.
I've got it. I'd be interested in your perspective on something. It seems to me like in the SLE field, especially equating, there's one enduring problem, and we characterize it as equity, in the sense that it, to me, is more an aspirational goal than one we know how to achieve. But that's not the way generally it's been treated in the literature. It's been either overlooked or various people debate various ways of characterizing equity, et cetera. I wonder about the following possibility. Suppose we change the focus and focused more on methods that quantify the extent to which first order equity and or second order equity are not achieved. Would that be a more productive way to address this issue? I see nothing problematic per se in having aspirational goals, but to leave it there seems problematic to me. And I don't think we've done a terribly good job of focusing on things that might be achievable, such as characterizing the degree to which we don't need it. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea. That's one reason why Paul and I got into the indices for subpopulation and variance, because we wanted some way of doing that. And it's also the reason why we put in that equal reliability case, because if you have a situation where you have a group, equal reliability doesn't mean reliability is the same in, say, males and females, but that the reliability of test X and test Y in the female group should be the same. And the reliability of test X and test Y in the male group should be the same. Because if strong equity holds, then that's a consequence you're going to get. And so if it does, so if you don't have equal reliability, you probably say, okay, then maybe something's amiss here with respect to equity. So that was, I think, an attempt on our part to sort of like get it in a very simple way. One of the things you're talking about. And yeah, I think there's definitely need for work in that area.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Or comments?
No.
I have a question, Neil. So you said every scale has to be repaired, right, on a regular basis, and I just wonder, like, what are the major sources of scale drift? Because I think it's there are a lot of reason for that, but I just wanted to hear any specific things that you took care for the SAT test.
Yeah, well, actually, about 20 years ago, 10 years ago, Shelby Haberman and I wrote a research report on this issue, sources of scale drift and things like that, and scale inconsistency. I don't remember the exact research report number, but I would recommend taking a look at that. You can always go, you can Google us, or you can go to ETS researcher and find it. We go into a lot of different sources of drift that could occur. So that's a short answer, and you can look there for the longer answer. And at this point, I'd like to point out that one of the advantages of having worked at ETS for so many years was that I work with colleagues like Shelby Haberman and Paul Holland and Ted Blue and Linda Cook and Ida Lawrence and a whole bunch of people, Jinghua Liu, and people from like all over the world, and all very smart people. And so I tried to follow the advice that I didn't know I was doing this, but I was following the advice that Kurt Vonnegut's father gave him a long time ago. Kurt Vonnegut was a novelist who some of you may not even heard of, but you can look him up. And his father said, son, try to hang around with people who are smarter than you. And that's sort of what I did when I was in graduate school. I hung out with Tucker, Charlie Lewis, and others, and colleagues of mine in school, and all the way through graduate school. So I just like to say that because I think we're running out of time, and you can look at the paper that Shelby and I did to answer your specific question.
Thank you. So it seems like it's time to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us again today, and thanks Neil for just such a great presentation with 4 videos. I know Ted and Neil work hard to create those videos, and we'll have another session next week. We'll have another guest speaker, Olina Bondivi, next week. So I hope everyone can join the last session of this webinar. And thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks everybody for showing up. It's fun.
Thank you, Neil.
See who was it.